Hey guys, what's going on? Paul here. Welcome back to another Cardano video. If you're new, make sure you hit the subscribe and the notification bell so that you never miss any of these updates. Also, please do give the video a like and let me know your thoughts down below as well. So this video is going to be a little bit different than usual. I sat down today with Alexander, who is the guy behind the Monad, I suppose the map system that you see here, which tracks how the Cardano ecosystem is growing out, where the relays are located, and lots of different information about the network. And then Patrick as well from NFT Maker, which allows anybody to turn an image that they have into an NFT. So what we talked about today wasn't related to, it's sort of related to the NFT Maker, but what it is Alexander is working on a new NFT project. And anyone who has talked to me privately or in live streams or in some of the videos or that about NFTs knows that it is a space that I'm very cautious about. And I generally don't bring any projects onto the channel here related to NFTs because I've seen a lot of, I suppose, projects and everything like that coming up over the last few years and then just disappearing, not having proper utility, lots of different hype cycles. And I feel that when NFTs launched on Cardano first, there was a real hype about it, but the majority of people were just buying into them, trying to get an item, trying to get an NFT with a rare item so they can flip it fairly quickly on the aftermarket. Now the aftermarket is definitely cooling down. So what I want to see is projects that are out there that are not just creating digital images that are NFTs and that's it. I want to see what is the utility beyond just collecting the images. Can they make something more than just the image for it? Because I think NFTs, the idea, the technology behind it is going to play a very big role in the future with how it's utilized. What else can be done outside of just a digital image? Now what Alexander is doing, now again, me bringing the guys on and talking about this is not endorsing the project or saying yes, this is one that people should buy, but when I see innovation, then it's always good to give that some airtime. What they are trying to do is, or what they are doing is, the NFTs that they are producing are going to be all on chain because the image is going to be a digitally created image and it's created by using code. So with standard NFTs now, what happens is the information about the NFT is stored on the blockchain, but the actual image behind it is stored on a separate server. So the link is then, it's stored on the blockchain, the link to the external image, and the image is then stored on IPFS, or some people even store them on private servers. So again, that means that if the image is changed later on or anything like that, then the link could be pointing to something different. Whereas when you do it with code, the code is embedded in the NFT, so anyone can reproduce that image if they just run the code or they compile the code. So it's an interesting concept. And first off, what happens is Alexander gives a presentation. Going into this, I didn't know what it was going to be about or anything like that, so I just recorded the conversation and we said we'd see later on if we put it out, but I think there definitely is some value there. I was going to try and cut it all up into little segments, but I feel that people can skip to what parts they want, so I will put timestamps down below. Alexander takes us through kind of building up to it first, then exactly what they're doing, and then we get into a bit of a conversation between the three of us about what they are actually doing and some stuff about the NFT space in general. So I do hope you guys get some value. Let me know down below if you want some more, I suppose, topics and conversations like this, and I will try and get more of them on the channel going forward as well. So thanks for watching, guys, and let's just jump into it.
Okay, so what we're talking about today is this idea of a programmatic NFT. And basically the whole idea is what's different about making art with a blockchain as opposed to making art and storing it on a blockchain, right? So looking at the medium of this kind of form and what it means for art and blockchains, right? So to give some quick context, where I'm coming from, I trained as an architect, and this is actually one of the first modern buildings built in 1906. It's in Austria. It's a postal savings and bank kind of building. And at first glance, it kind of looks like a classical building, right? But when you look closely, you see there's all these like little rivets and everything. It's a little bit different. And then when you go inside, you realize, oh, this thing is basically a product of concrete, steel, and glass. And so in architecture, we kind of learn about, when people start building buildings with stones and bricks, like what did those new materials of concrete, steel, and glass allow us to do differently. Does that make sense to you? Right? Like, how could we build space differently? You know, you get much larger spans, more open spaces, all this natural light coming in. Just to hammer the point home, this is a famous German architect called Mies van der Rohe, Barcelona Pavilion in 1928. And you can see in 20 years, you know, we went from this, which was starting out, to kind of like high modernism style. And kind of the idea that I want to kind of explore is like, what does it mean to put art on a blockchain, and how can you kind of take advantage of the uniqueness of a blockchain? And is it just that we're putting JPEGs on a chain, right? To me, that's a little bit unsatisfying. It's like we're using a blockchain as just like a Dropbox or Google Drive, right? Just like throwing some, you know, photos on it. But I actually want to think about like, what's the difference between an oil painting and a watercolor, right? You wouldn't try to do the same thing in either one. And, you know, does that make sense to you where I'm coming from here? Like, is there an opportunity to make stuff in a blockchain that is different than traditional art? That's
Yeah,
basically the
can
idea.
there be more than just a link on the blockchain to an
Yeah,
external JPEG file?
exactly that. That's one of the key things. So I actually looked at this guy who I was kind of a fan of. This is an American artist called Saul LeWitt. And what's interesting, I mean, you if you've been to like a modern art museum, you've probably seen stuff like this on the wall. But what's kind of unique about what he did was he would actually like write down a set of instructions on like an index card for how to create these things, and then someone in the museum or the gallery would paint them directly on the wall following his instructions. So he wasn't the actual one executing it, but it's still considered a Saul LeWitt painting, right? And so how does that work out? This is an example of one of these cards where he has basically 16 different drawings, this arcs and straight lines, squiggly lines, and dash lines. And if you look at this plan, this big open rectangle is like the floor plan of a gallery space. He's saying, you know, like in this corner, put 1 and 2 on top of each other. So this arc and that arc. And what that ends up looking like is, this is actually a Mies van der Rohe museum, you know, all these different things put on top of each other. Sometimes you get these weird coincidences, like a circle is drawn here, but this is in I think the MoMA in New York, but you kind of get where I'm coming from, like all these different things smashed on top of each other in a kind of algorithmic combinatorial way. This is another piece of his, right? Just these very simple black lines, yellow lines, red lines, blue lines, and it's called band of color in 4 directions in all combinations, right? So, you know, you start to mix and match 2 of these, 3 of these, and, you know, this has a very interesting price.
It's yeah, some of the
Yeah,
prices for artwork is
right.
it's crazy to me.
It's crazy.
Even
Yeah.
the NFTs are going that way,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's
It's
mental.
it's it's weird, but I kind of like this idea of like, to me, even though this is from the 70s, it's a very kind of algorithmic design kind of thing, right? Like you have this set of instructions on how it's made, and it's kind of interesting. I work as a building AI models now, and I kind of like this kind of marriage of art and instructions, because that's kind of very similar to programming. So next we're going to get into what we're actually doing. I'm calling this like constructive geometry. So some basic building blocks for what we're doing. Basically, for people who aren't aware, like every image stored on a computer basically has 3 channels to it: a red and a green and a blue channel, right? If you look under a magnifying glass at your monitor, you'll actually see red, green, and blue pixels. And these are generally stored as 8-bit values, numbers between 0 and 255. So if something is black, it will be 000 in the red, green, and blue channel. And if it's something's white, it'll be 255, 255, 255 in red, green, and blue. And all the variations in between kind of store that, right? So this is kind of like the paint of a JPEG. What I then do is I take, you know, if we think about a normal distribution or a cumulative distribution, this is like basically a bell curve or an S curve. You can imagine a very simple kind of gradient. This is, imagine that the painting we're talking about, or the photo or image we're talking about, is just a 5 by 5 pixel array. In a normal distribution, if you were to take this bell curve, you'd get something like what I've drawn here, where the red is a kind of column, right? Green column, blue column. And in the S curve, you'd get this kind of very simple kind of gradient going up. And then we add in another kind of component, which is, let's rotate these. So if you start at the bottom of this kind of diagram, the 0 degrees is just the normal. If you rotate it 90 degrees, the vertical column turns into a horizontal line. The cumulative one goes from like right oriented to coming from the top. And then when we go to 180, it doesn't make sense to do that to the normal, because you're just back to vertical again, right? So we don't bother doing that. But cumulative, that means it comes from the left. And then 270-degree rotation means you're coming up from the bottom. On top of that, there's this idea of like unsigned integers, which is kind of fun. When I first learned programming, you kind of learn this thing. So what's 2 plus 2, Paul? We're gonna put you on the spot.
Is it the obvious 4?
Yeah, you're right. So 2 plus 2 is 4 in unsigned integer space, right? But what 10 plus 10 is actually not 20 in this 4-bit representation. If we look here, 10 plus 10 is 4. And how does that work? Well, you start at 10, you move 5 over, you get to 15. Basically, a 4-bit integer can be any number between 0 and 15, but it doesn't know what to do beyond that. So what happens is you basically start back over again, right? So when you get to 15 and you count to 6, you're back at 0. And then 7 goes to 1, 8 goes to 2, you're up to 4. It's kind of like the scene in The Matrix where Neo is stuck in the train station, right? And he tries running out of the track and he ends up at the other side. Do you get what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
Right. It's basically that kind of thing. Is that a decent explanation, Patrick?
Definitely.
Unsigned integers. There we go. So what we're doing is we're taking all these things that we've just talked about and we're calling them like properties, right? And if you start with just like an array of pixels, which are just empty, and then let's put a cumulative blue layer into that, right? That's like this S-curve looking thing. So you get like black on one side and it gets gradually more and more blue. Let's take above that a green layer, which is rotated 90 degrees, right? So you see the green is coming at you from the front of the image, whereas the blue is coming from the right, right? And then if you were to add these two together, smash them together, you basically get this kind of gradient type effect, right? Of dark blue on the right, green in the front, and the cyan kind of mixture of the two in the front right corner and black in the back, right? So this is at a very simple level. We're doing this at a much higher resolution, but if you can understand these kind of order of operations, this is how we're building up, and this is how we make all of the NFTs in the space. And so basically the idea is that in the minting transaction that we'll do is like the first NFT will basically have a kind of declaration for like the environment necessary to execute it and a simple set of properties. And all of the other NFTs in the space will basically point at that minting transaction and have a set of arguments or properties to be run against this function, right? We go through that, we eliminate a bunch of things. There's actually 50 million ways of combining these parameters that I just talked about. If you have 6 of them in all the various ways, we do a bunch of like reductive filters to eliminate the noise a bit, and we get down to 31,000 of them, which is like 0.06% of 50 million. And this is what we end up with, right? So if you look here, I'm just going to go through quickly. These are like random gallery kind of samplings. You get all these kind of crazy, I think some of them are quite beautiful actually, combinations of slightly different, everything is unique things. And if we look more closely, the examples of this is like, here's the 7th one. This is kind of like the sample that we talked about in the beginning. It's just going from, black to blue, and it has one property, right? This first number is the multiplier. Like we can talk about that in a little bit. It's blue. It's a cumulative distribution. It's got no rotation. So this is how that works, right? If we go into the 12th one, it's red, and what happens here is because the multiplier is 2. Remember what we talked about, like counting over or starting over with the unsigned integer? So basically what's happening is like we're going from left to right, we get to the max, and then it starts over again, right? So that's what causes this black line. And it's very simple, but you start to add these properties together, you start to build in the rotation, and you start to get more and more kind of complexity coming about, right? Especially when you start to mix colors. So this number at the top is the number of the NFT in the sequence. And you start to get, interesting color combinations and interesting geometries, just more and more as a function of the stuff. If we keep going, through the series, this is just examples of the different pieces, their properties. And sometimes unique things happen, right? Like this white one is actually, to make white, as we mentioned earlier, all red, green, and blue channels have to be the same. So I don't think there's very many of these in the collection, right? Where, everything is in sync. The red and the green and the blue channels are all kind of balanced with each other to result in white. So that was kind of interesting to me. And as you just add these properties in, as you climb up, you start to get very kind of crazy kind of things. And I'm just imagining these, like printed out or projected on a wall, like 2 meters by 2 meters. I think they'd be quite kind of interesting to look at. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I've kind of done some quick analysis because I think, NFT space, this is what a lot of people are looking for. But basically, there's this kind of distribution of the number of properties an NFT has in this kind of collection, right? Where the bulk of them have between 4 and 5, some of them have 6, a few have 1, 2, and 3, right? It gets very, very scarce. And what's interesting to me about this is not necessarily, the rarity. It's like a Pokemon card or something, but it's the idea that, to me, the most interesting ones are these, 4, 5, and 6s. But in terms of like what's going on in the NFT space right now, it's probably these 1, 2s, and 3s, which are actually quite simple, right? Those simple like monocolor gradients, which are rarer. So I'm trying to kind of turn that on its head a little bit and play with, what do people want versus what is rare, and how is this market kind of operating a bit? If we break down the different properties, there's these multipliers, there's the colors, there's the different, bell curve versus the S curve, and the degrees of rotation. These are the kind of percent occurrences of each of those properties. And here's where I think it gets the most interesting to me, but I'm trying to introduce this idea of like horizontal scarcity, where, like rather than just looking at some Excel sheet that tells you, oh, this NFT is rare, right? The idea that I kind of want to play with is I've arranged 4 kind of normal rarity things here, right? But if you look closely, you can see that this upper right NFT kind of links up perfectly with the one on the left in terms of color and lines, and the one below it is also kind of linked perfectly, and it is linked to this one. So like, I think there's something interesting that could happen when we release this, where people take something that's kind of average, but by kind of hunting and trading to collect, a set, they can actually build a larger composition. And I can imagine that if you were just to have this one in the upper right, it might be just like a normal one, right? But when you start to present these larger and larger kind of displays, right, you could probably trade that to someone else who likes what you've done, because you've almost kind of created your own art piece, right? By doing this work of looking through the entire collection and turning on and off different filters to find the right piece that kind of fits in how you want it. And so there's this idea that maybe it's the pairing that creates value, or actually, I know this is shocking, like aesthetic appreciation that creates value rather than a rarity table. Do you get what I'm saying, right? Like, what do you want? What looks cool to you? What do you think is beautiful, rather than, oh, this one is like 0.1% rare, right? And the goal of this thing is kind of just to produce a kind of collection which starts this kind of conversation about what are we doing with art on blockchains? How do we do things differently? And all of this, sorry if I didn't, I skipped over in the beginning. All of this is like generated from Python, which is a language we chose because it's more like pedagogically accessible. It's more a little bit easier to understand and read. So when people are looking at this, I hope they can kind of use it as an on-ramp maybe to learn some programming.
But yeah, I mean, I think the most important point here that maybe got a little bit lost in this whole like technical explanation is basically that we don't store the images on just IPFS. We all create them basically programmatically with code, and all the code that is used to generate these NFTs or these images is actually stored on the blockchain.
Yeah.
And I mean, the blockchain is not there to make to store a lot of data, right? So that's the main problem. That's why we don't store actual images on the blockchain. But if we have like just a little bit of code and parameters that we have to store to generate an image, then we can put it on the blockchain without having to worry about the size constraints.
Exactly. And it's resolution independent, right? Like you can, when you run the code, you can tell it you want a 4K image or a 20 billion K image, right? Like it's basically like 20 lines of text, which produce an arbitrary resolution. And so 20 lines of text, if you've been on a site like Cardano Wall, is very easy to mint into a transaction, right? But storing, like a 4K image directly on the Cardano blockchain isn't. So that's why I'm kind of arguing that this is kind of like the native medium of like Cardano or blockchain-based art, right? It's how do you think about not just how do I draw something in Photoshop and then throw it on the blockchain, but how do you kind of use the native language of a blockchain to produce a set of aesthetically pleasing experiences, right? I'm
Yeah,
still trying to get my camera working.
I think that's what I was saying earlier, that like a lot of, so again, NFT space isn't something I've got too deep into, but a lot of NFTs out there now, or pretty much all of them, is just a link out to an external, I suppose, source of where the image is. So is there something in place that stops someone swapping out the image at a later date, or how does that side work for myself and for anyone else watching that doesn't understand that?
So just to be clear, so what we were going to basically provide is a set of source code, just like you compile the Cardano node or something, pulling it from Git, except that code will actually be minted into the transaction, right? So if you were to copy that code and paste it and run it in a Python runtime environment, it would print out your NFT on your desktop, right? So as long as Cardano is running and as long as you can see the kind of transaction, no one will be able to take away that NFT from you, right? Whereas if an IPFS or Amazon Cloud Storage went down, like your NFT is gone. In our case, as long as Cardano is alive, this art is going to be able to be generated, right? We're also going to include an IPFS link just to fit into the existing ecosystem of like Pool PM, so that those guys can like render it right in their wallets and follow along with these kind of standards. But the IPFS link isn't necessary for us, right? Because people can, and I would encourage them to, run these things locally and even mess with the code, right? I'm kind of excited by the idea that people forking this project, right? And like, Alex, you didn't know what the fuck you were doing, right? This is a much better version of it, right? Here's version 2 of, we're calling these unsigned algorithms because, like signatures have a lot to do with cryptography and art, ownership, all these kind of thing. And it's because it's all algorithmically generated. I can imagine, the community taking it in a few different directions. So I'm still trying to get my camera to work, but I hope that was interesting.
Yeah, that sounds good. I suppose that summarizes it completely. Then what you're trying to do is get away from having the external links, having it all on the blockchain. And then so what you were showing there was the mix of the colors and the angles and everything like that. Mm-hmm. Can the code then be used to create the types of NFTs we're seeing out there now? So I won't name specific projects or anything like that. We'll say Space Buds, which was the first one.
Well, so if they stored, if they could represent their thing in code, like this is what a helmet looks like, and you would actually write some code for a kind of vector representation, probably. Have you ever used Illustrator or Photoshop?
Yeah, I use Photoshop. All right, Illustrator.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit weird, right? Like these lines, these weird things, right? So basically, vectors are much more how do you say, easy to store because they're just representations of math. Whereas as a rasterized image or Photoshop, you have to store something for each pixel, right? So that would be a little bit difficult. But I actually think, in a thing like Space Buds, you could maybe mint, like the 20 base components, like this helmet, this gadget, this everything. And then you would basically make an NFT, which was composed of those things, right? You'd say NFT 3215 points to that helmet, that character, that thing, and those base elements could be stored on a blockchain. I wouldn't really recommend it. Patrick, what do you think? Because they're kind of large, right, to store those kind of things directly on chain. But
yeah, I mean,
it would be
depends.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the complexity of the whole NFT. Basically, I mean, Spacebuds is not super complex, so you could easily represent it as like some math functions. But
Cardano bits would work pretty easily, right? Because
Cardano bits would be perfect.
Would work easy because that it's so low pixel. You could just say a zombie has this pixel representation. Bloody thing is this, knife is this, all the different things, right? And each of those is what, like 8x8 or something pixels. So that would be very easy to kind of store in this way. But for us, it's just like mathematical arrays of these things that are done that way. So it's kind of exciting to me.
Yeah, it's great to see, I suppose, new improvements on what's there. What about other blockchains then? Again, having looked into the NFT space, do they all use links to external images as well? Or is there anything else like this on other blockchains? Or how how everyone else is doing it?
I would say that like 90% or even more, like probably 99% of all NFT projects are using this link to another external storage. And they mostly use, of course, IPFS, but others just link it to basically a website or whatever. And there have definitely been approaches to like programmatic art generation on the blockchain, especially on Ethereum, but nothing of this scale, in my opinion, yet. And I think I personally love stuff like this. I'm coming from studying computer science, and I'm very interested in games and game development. And they use a lot of procedural generated art to basically fill their gaming worlds. And I just want to see this combined with the blockchain to really be able to express this sort of idea in a new way.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add in about it, or are you launching a collection, an NFT collection, or what are you doing with this as the first, I suppose, utilization of this method?
So we're actually trying to launch this. Patrick, are you comfortable saying when we're shooting for, or?
I don't know. It's really hard to say. So definitely in the next 2 weeks. Yeah.
So we're gonna basically take what Patrick has done with NFT Maker and kind of repurpose it for a specific collections drop. And the way that works is there's a bunch of different ways of doing an NFT drop, right? One is like you just send money to an address and like hope for a few weeks that something comes back later, which is kind of like a high trust kind of system, right? So the reason I kind of reached out to Patrick was I saw how easy it was to use NFT Maker. And here, rather than someone submitting their own NFT, right, like they are just buying an NFT. But the idea is, right, you send money to the address, and it should be more like Space Buds or Cardano Warriors kind of thing, where you instantly get back, or within 5 to 15 minutes, right, as we're kind of batching these transactions out, you'll get a NFT sent back to your wallet. And that's how we're proposing it to work, right? But I do like that kind of quicker turnaround time, because I think a strong principle of blockchain is trust, or verify, not trust kind of thing. And so just hoping that you get something back is a little bit iffy. And I'm hoping our reputations in the space, right? Patrick as being contributing this NFT Maker, and me with my very small monad pool, what do you call it? Map thing. I believe we have small reputations at stake, right?
Yeah, I suppose you guys have faces out in the open. People know who you are, where there's lots of projects have launched and nobody knows anything about them. And I think when NFTs first came out on Cardano, there was the big FOMO into it that everyone was just looking for the quick flip. No one, well, I won't say no one, but I'd say 90% of people weren't interested in what the actual project was. It was just, can I get a rare item and then do a quick flip on the aftermarket, which has kind of cooled down now. Maybe once we get smart contracts and stuff like that, and there's fully automated marketplaces, things might kick off a bit better then. But even the space, it's incredible to see the innovation that has been there we don't have smart contracts. So things will be so much easier when we do, but to see what projects are putting together out there that without smart contracts, it's great to see people already working with that. It gets me excited to think what is potentially going to come when we have, I suppose, the real technology behind it to make this process so much easier, and teams can concentrate on other stuff rather than spending so much time on the distribution of the assets.
For sure.
It'll be much easier if we have basically a smart contract which controls the minting of these things, right? Because it's just from our perspective, we don't have to set up some servers and do all this stuff, right? If we can just write some Plutus and then say that, if you send this amount of ADA to this thing, we will generate an NFT from this set of, possible NFTs and send it back to you, right? And it's kind of interesting. Plutus is kind of difficult, and Haskell's difficult to kind of wrap your head around. But compared to working in like AWS and typical cloud kind of stuff, there are some kind of very nice advantages to running your code on a blockchain without having to worry about where is this being executed and setting up, these different permissions and security settings in AWS. So it's kind of fun to think about that.
Yeah, no
And
server
I'm looking
overload or
forward to
anything like
yeah.
that then either.
Yeah.
When you have your own private servers.
Yeah, and of course, you know, that will be like ultimate kind of trustless kind of thing where someone can review the code before they decide to send it, or people in the community can and say, yes, this actually, if you do send ADA to this thing, you will get back, you know, something like this, which is what they're saying. And kind of on the note that you noted right now about secondary sales or like the artist getting a cut in the future. I think Patrick has an idea, right? Like we could kind of do that now where we would mint a field in like, this is the artist address and they want, you know, N%, 2 or 5 or whatever percent of future sales. It would be incumbent on the platform to respect that metadata right now, right? Like if he's NFT maker or he, you know, any of these other platforms that are coming online, if it's done in the native token way where that Alessandro came up with Space Buds, then it's kind of honor system for a platform to honor that, right? But it is possible that people could respect that, right? Or that a platform could enforce a rule like that. But yeah, right now it's kind of not so possible without some kind of trust in there.
Yeah, I suppose you can still have private sales then where if you have an NFT that I want, I can just send you the money privately and we can swap it that way. So that cuts out the artist. I think I'm looking forward to seeing when that type of stuff comes in. It gives extra utility to the NFT. So when an artist does something, they can get a lifetime cut of any future sales because it's hard coded into the smart contract that 5%, 10% of any future sales goes to them, or even tie in the NFTs to something outside of just the digital art as well. I think there's a lot of use cases that can come outside
it's
of
a little bit off topic, but actually this is something that makes me a little bit uncomfortable about NFTs. And like, if that feature was available, I've given serious thought to maybe we just give away all of the NFTs for free, right? To you sign up, you send like a minimal amount of ADA or something just to register an address, you get it back. And then, you know, I would only make money from a percent of future sales, right? Like, because there's something very weird to me. My friends have participated. I haven't bought any NFTs, right? But kind of like you said, he bought like 30 of this one project and he got one of the rare ones that there were 23 of and he flipped it for like 18,000 ADA, right? He spent like 500 ADA on all the NFTs and then he made, you know, like an insane amount of ADA. And then he sold another one for 3,000, right? But it's a very bad kind of experience right now where like you send out 30 transactions, maybe 15 of them go through, the other 15 are refunded, right? And it's kind of not really satisfying to me because like, yeah, the person who released the NFT gets a bunch of money for selling through their 10,000 pieces or whatever, but it is this kind of like flippers market, right? Where I think if we want to build like sustainable real art on blockchains, like artists should get kind of more of the proceeds or something.
Yeah, I think it incentivizes, say, if it's just a piece of art, then that's fine. They'll get the sale. But if it's something outside of just a piece of art, it incentivizes the seller or the developers to bring utility to it later as well. So if you're talking about creating NFTs that take part in a game or something like this, because I think that space is only going to get bigger and bigger because a lot of the younger generation now are growing up with games and buying special features within games. So that will be NFTs in the future. So if it incentivizes the company that any future sales of items or the actual characters that they get a cut, they're going to keep developing the games to bring more and more interest. So I definitely like that side of it.
Yeah. So for me, this is really kind of exploring like how do we go one step closer in that direction where like there's a bit of a programmable aspect to the thing, right? It does fit nicer into a blockchain, and I can see this kind of right now. All of these images are static, but there was an idea early on that in the future you might have something that like actually looked at the owner's address to determine like what the colors were or what the size of different elements are, right? Or as a function of time, it actually changes, right? But just to keep things kind of simple and manageable in terms of complexity, for this version, it is kind of like a set of code which produces a static PNG JPEG image, right, of arbitrary resolution. But there's so many cool things that could happen. I'm really excited that, you know, once this idea is kind of thrown out there, I'm sure smarter and, you know, more creative people will kind of do really amazing things with it. So for me, you know, I think I listed one of the slides. The goal of this is really just to start this conversation and get this kind of idea out there, right, in the community, so that we can kind of see where it goes. Because I'm not a professional artist, right? Like I studied architecture. I like to, you know, draw and do stuff like that. But I'm sure people who do this as like their life and their passion can come up with even better ideas, right?
Yeah, and just on the aging thing, would that be in
Mhm.
line with, I've seen proposals, I don't know if there's any working projects out there
Mhm.
of like raising race horses or raising animals or stuff like that. So over time they get older, or what seeing down through the years was different things targeted
Yeah.
at kids like Tamagotchis and all this type of stuff down through the years of you raise them, you have to look after them. And is
Mhm.
that type of stuff
That's
will
totally possible. My idea that I was going to implement, it was the idea of a time step, whether it's a second or a day or a month. Like I was just going to make these art pieces, but the idea would be like that art piece would change based on the time step, and there would be one version that changes very quickly and then dies, basically because it, you know, it's changed so much and used up all its life, and there'd be another piece that like changed once every millennia, and like it would go on and on for tens of thousands of years, right? But would never really. And my question was like, which one would people value, right? If these are technically the same art piece, but they kind of clip along at different speeds, right? There's this idea that, you know, do I want something that will kind of grow within my lifetime, or will be kind of completed when I die, or after I die for my kids? You know, there's some interesting stuff, I think, just because like what's going on in the NFT space is so crazy, right? Like with all these inflated values and everything, like a little bit's like performance art, like what is it that humans value, why are we doing this, and just to kind of like throw that light on the space, and kind of, it's almost like a science experiment. What's going to happen, how are people going to react to that, right? Like
yeah, the hype and FOMO and everything is kind of what has turned me off
Mhm.
a lot of the
Yeah.
NFT side, because I was here through the 2017, 2018 ICO booms and stuff like that. So I've seen so many
Yeah.
come and go so quickly, and rug
For
pulls and
sure.
everything, that it's made me a bit maybe too cautious in some ways
No,
on some
no,
of the stuff
that's good.
launching. But I definitely like the idea of growing it, that it's more than what it is now. Like it's great to see the
Mhm.
innovation that's there,
Mhm.
but where does it go next? And having
Yeah.
something like this, that it's fully dependent on the blockchain without plugging, like if you start putting all your images on the blockchain, that's
Yeah.
not good for any blockchain to take up that type of space. So having workarounds for that is really, really interesting.
And part of this too, I mean, both of us, I think, are trying to be full-time Cardano developers. You know, Patrick has a proposal in Catalyst for taking NFT Maker into a full-blown platform.
Yeah, I'll
I
put a
have
link
a
to that below if you
great.
both have proposals in, I'll
Thank
put
you.
links to them down below, and the NFT maker and your map as well. I can include all of
Yeah,
that stuff below for
awesome.
people who want to see
And
more.
and I also have a insurance tech idea out there that I started on Catalyst. It's being voted on in Fund 4, but I've actually started talking to some venture capital people and trying to take that as a thing. But this was part of the reason, you know, for this NFT thing, was just to kind of explore the possibility and mechanism for self-funding, right? So if this drops, if this is successful, like I can afford to work full time on that insurance tech thing, right? And basically quit my day job. And I think Patrick is graduating right very soon, and
Yeah.
this NFT thing would be a multiple or several multiples of your Catalyst proposal, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Catalyst is great and all,
Yeah.
but the amount of money that some people make with NFTs is just insane. And I mean, you just need money to really build a platform that is competitive with like the big ETH platforms, right? And I definitely want to be in the space for a long time. I'm probably gonna graduate and then, you know, work on Cardano stuff and then work on more Cardano stuff, and that's gonna be my life for the next few years, which is very exciting.
So yeah, part of this is like, you know, not to get too off topic from the actual art pieces, because I do want people to genuinely like buy these and actually like them and potentially put them on their wall, like but like it's kind of just looking at the ecosystem for what exists now. This seemed to be like a pretty interesting way to raise money for other, Cardano related project funding, right? And the people get something that they're perhaps interested in, they get something out of it, and everyone's kind of happy. So I'm interested in how this space evolves, how developers can make a living on Cardano and then push things forward. So obviously programmatically generated art is a little bit easier coming from a programming background than other stuff, but yeah, I'm quite happy with how the collection turned out, and I'm pretty excited to see how people react and nervous. And I'm anticipating a big egg on my face, right? And like, oh, how embarrassing was that? But if you don't risk anything, you don't get anything. So I'm willing to take that chance.
That's it, and it's different as well. It's not like I feel a lot of the projects coming out now are just copies of what's already out there. So you're completely different. So people, I'm sure there's lots of people out there are happy to see innovation in the space and in what's going on. So that in itself is going to attract a lot of attention out there.